This section is on types of neural circuits. So there's four we're going to look at. First two are pretty easy. Just basic vocab tells you what they do. Third one is, once we talk about it, it'll remind you of a feedback system. And then the fourth one is a little bit different. So let's just kind of hit the highlights of them. And then there's an image. I've got a slide here that's your image. So we're going to look at diverging, where we start with a single source and we move to many. We're going to talk about converging, where they all come, we have multiple initial sources and they all funnel into one point. Reverberating is kind of like a feedback loop. It's a lot like a feedback loop where something happens and then further down the way there's an input back to cause this to keep going. This is about the equivalent of a positive feedback loop. And then parallel after discharge, that's the fourth and final one we're going to talk about. We have a start point. It runs in three different sets so that we're going to gather multiple different types of information and then put them back onto a single output. So if I go back and talk about those, diverging is where one nerve fiber branches and then synapses with several postsynaptic cells. So you start out with one and you spread the information out to multiples. And it works, right? Because it's one neuron has the information and now it's sending it out, and you can have hundreds that are going to receive that information. If we think about how our classroom is set up, when we're in class, we have a normal lecture situation and the instructor is speaking and the students are the receiving neurons, the postsynaptic neurons who are getting all that information. So the knowledge of one gets dispersed to many. Converging or converging is the opposite of diverging. So in converging, you've got input from a whole bunch of different nerve fibers and they're funneled into one neuron or one neuron pool, if you will. So it would be kind of like if I asked an open-ended question in class and you all just started sending information my way. Okay? Some of it's going to be positive, some of it's going to be negative, and then just like the neurons, it's my job to weigh if this is excitatory or inhibitory or what, right? Okay, reverberating circuits have neurons that are lined up in a linear sequence, okay? So almost in series. So one stimulates the next, stimulates the next, stimulates the next. But one or more of those later cells is then going to have an axon that comes back and stimulates the very first cell and starts the process all over again. Very much like a positive feedback loop that we learned about at the beginning of the semester. A good example of this would be the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. Fourth example is parallel after discharge. And that was that image that was in purple, I think. So you have an input neuron. It diverges out, so it goes from one to multiples. In our diagram, it was 3. Okay, so you have several chains. Each chain has a different number of synapses. So each one of those is going to go through a different series of linear synapse transfers, and eventually at the end they're all going to reconverge back onto one. Okay, but they're not going to all do it at once. So there'll be, some signal's going to get there first, then maybe a different signal's going to get there, and then a third signal. So it kind of spreads it out. After discharge has this continuous firing after the stimulus stops. So what that means is when you look at it, and remember that these are happening at different times. So if we had just one pathway, right, and this input went through and it went boom, 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 and it would get here, and it would fire this next neuron, and it would just continue. But under parallel after discharge, we have that same thing, boom, 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 and this is going to fire this. But look, this pathway is probably going to be quicker. So before this signal reaches the output point, this one's going to come in first, and then this one, and then this one. Now, if you had more than 3 pathways here, what you could have is you could be continually firing this neuron from one impulse that started here. Okay, so it's a way of taking one impulse here and turning it into multiple impulses at this point. Series and parallel processing. So we talked about types of neural circuits, so now we're going to talk about processing. So in serial processing, the neurons relay information along a path that's pretty simple. It's basically linear. One triggers the next, triggers the next, triggers the next, triggers the next. And they go in order, that order, every time. So in a series processing format, you can only process, so the information can only be processed through one specific flow. So you can only do it, that information at a time, one pathway. So reading a book or watching a television movie. You can't do both. You can jump and forth back between them, but you can't literally read the book, have your eyes on the book, and watch the movie. You can read the book and listen to the movie, right? But you can't literally look at both things. You can't watch both at the same time. Okay, that's serial processing. One after the other after the other. Simple pathway in a line, limits what you can do. Parallel processing is a little bit different. Parallel processing is kind of like parallel after firing. So in parallel processing, the information gets transmitted along diverging circuits through multiple pathways, and those pathways can act simultaneously with different purposes or different outcomes. Okay, so when you're driving your car, your visual system, so you've got your occipital portion of your brain is going to be working with the eyes. They're going to process traffic patterns. They're going to process colors, shapes, depths of field. So how close are you to the car in front of you? How close is the car next to you? Are they closing in on your lane, right? You're going to process motion. Is some dog darting out in front of your car from the side? At the same time, parallel to that, you're processing sound. Okay, you're processing the sound of traffic. You're listening. You're processing if sirens go off. You're also processing signals from your own body, your motion sensors. Have you ever realized that you were speeding without looking at your odometer, right? You do that because you're processing it visually, but maybe if it's dark and at night, you process it because of how your body feels in the motion. Okay, so that's the difference between serial and parallel processing. And then memory and, I'm going to pause and we'll pick up memory on the next one.